First light hadn't yet burned the frost off the platform boards when Clara Merritt watched the porter swing her last trunk onto the baggage car. And she told herself, hard, that this would not break her twice. The depot at Half Moon smelled of coal smoke and wet cedar. Somewhere behind her, Silas Merritt stood with his hat pushed back and his thumbs hooked in his vest, watching her go the way a man watches a debt finally paid. He had not offered to carry so much as her hatbox. He had only come, he'd said, to be certain she truly left. Train's the 10 o'clock, he told her, as if she hadn't lived beside these tracks 11 years and didn't know the schedule better than the station master himself. Papers'll be filed by noon. Nothing left here for you to come back for, Clara. She did not answer him. She had learned in 3 years of widowhood that answering Silas only fed him. She turned instead to look down the empty street, where the false-fronted stores were just opening their shutters, where the schoolhouse bell had not yet rung, where somewhere past the livery a spring still ran cold and sweet across the back 40 of the only home she had ever truly loved, the home that would belong by supper to a man who had never once loved it, only wanted it. She had a post waiting in Laramie. A friend from her convent school days had written of a teaching position, modest but honest, and Clara had written back before she'd let herself think too hard on leaving. Because if she thought too hard, she would remember that leaving Half Moon meant leaving the last ground where she and Jessie Lowell had ever walked together as two people who believed the whole world still lay ahead of them. She had not let herself think his name in longer than she could say. It surprised her now, standing at the rail with her hand still smelling of her own kitchen soap, how much it still cost her. The night before, she had sat up late by a single lamp, folding the last of her linens into the trunk, and Agatha Byon had come across the dark field between their two properties with a shawl over her nightgown, unwilling to let her friend spend her final night in Half Moon entirely alone. You could still fight it, Agatha had said, settling into the chair across from her. Whitlock himself says the signature troubles him. Troubles isn't proof, Agatha. I haven't the money to hire a lawyer of my own to argue against a bank that's already decided, and I haven't the strength left to keep losing a fight I can't win. I lost Thomas. I lost the spring. I'll not lose what's left of my dignity standing in a courtroom being called a grasping widow by men who have already made up their minds. She had folded a nightdress with hands that would not quite stop trembling. Better to go somewhere new and be only a school teacher, and no one's tragedy at all. And Jessie Lowell, Agatha had said gently, the way only an old friend dares. Is that any part of why you're running or only the land? Clara had not answered that question honestly even to herself in 8 years, and she did not begin that night either. There's no Jessie Lowell in this, she'd said. There hasn't been in a very long time. She had believed it mostly, until she stood on this platform in the cold morning, and found the lie of it rising up in her throat like water behind a dam. 12 miles east, Jessie Lowell swung down off a tired bay gelding in front of the mercantile and nearly ran into old Otis Prout, who was hauling a crate of horseshoe nails through his own front door. Lowell, Otis set the crate down like it had suddenly gotten heavier. Didn't expect you back in Half Moon. Not after, he stopped himself, the way men in small towns stop themselves when a subject is understood to be closed. Selling horses to the army post, Jessie said. Passing through only. He'd told himself the same thing for 3 days on the trail, and he still didn't believe it. He'd taken this road instead of the shorter one south for no reason he could name, except that some part of him had never stopped riding toward this town in his sleep, the way a compass needle doesn't stop wanting north simply because a man refuses to look at it. He had built a whole life on refusing to look at it. 8 years of driving cattle for other men's brands, of turning down 2 decent women who'd have had him gladly in Cheyenne, and in Ogallala both, of telling himself he simply wasn't the marrying kind, when the truer thing was that he had already given the only part of himself worth giving to a girl in a gray dress in a dooryard outside Half Moon, and had never once managed to want it back. He could still call up, whenever he let his guard down, the particular sound the river had made the night it took the herd, a low, grinding roar in the dark that he'd mistaken at first for thunder, until the water was already through the camp, and the cattle were bawling and scattering in every direction across ground gone to soup. He had gone in after a dozen head trapped against a cutbank, and come out with his horse dead beneath him and his own leg bent wrong at the shin. And he had lain 3 days in a line rider's dugout with a Ute woman, setting the bone, as best she could before a wagon could even reach him to carry him to a doctor. He had written to Clara from that dugout, hands shaking with fever, promising he was alive and would come the moment he could sit a horse, and he had believed, lying there, that the letter would reach her the way all the others had. It had not. None of them had. He had ridden home 11 months late instead of the one he'd promised, half crippled and thinner than a fence rail, rehearsing the whole way what he would say to make up the lost time, and none of the words had mattered in the end, because there had been a wedding band on her hand before he ever reached her gate. "Shame you didn't pass through a year back," Otis said, wiping his hands on his apron. "Might have caught Merritt before the fever took him. Widows had a hard road since." Jesse went still in a way that had nothing to do with the cold morning. "Widow," he said. Otis looked at him with the particular pity of a man delivering news he assumed had already been received. "Clara, Thomas Merritt's widow, 3 years now. You didn't know." Jesse had known Clara Vance had married Thomas Merritt 8 years back, while he was still 300 miles north, with a leg splinted crooked, and cattle scattered across a flooded river bottom. He had ridden home 11 months late instead of the one he'd promised, and found her already a bride, and told himself that was simply how it went for men who left girls waiting on promises. He had not let himself learn anything more of her life since. It had seemed, at the time, the only mercy he could still do her to stay gone, and let her be happy without the shadow of him standing at the edge of it. "She's fixing to leave on the 10 o'clock, Otis went on, oblivious to what his words were doing to the man in front of him. "Silas Merritt's foreclosing the homestead. Some paper Thomas signed over, they say, before he took sick. Bank's siding with Silas. Whole town knows it smells wrong, but nobody's got the proof to say so out loud, and Silas has been round to every man with a say in it, making certain it stays that way." "What kind of certain?" Jesse said. "Man's been buying drinks at the saloon for a week, talking up how his brother always meant the water rights for him, how Clara's had her chance and ought to move along graceful-like instead of dragging the county through a scandal. Bank clerk's cousin to Silas's wife, if you want to know why the paper went through so quick and quiet." Otis shook his head. "It ain't right, but it ain't my fight, and the town's got a short memory for a widow once she's out of sight." Jesse looked toward the sun, already climbing, and did the arithmetic of miles and minutes the way he'd once done it counting cattle against a coming storm. The depot was 2 miles off. The bay was spent from 3 days' hard riding, and somewhere in the space of that morning, a train was going to carry away the only thing he had ever wanted badly enough to still dream of at 31 years old. "Otis," he said, "I need a fresh horse, and I need it now. Take the chestnut out back. Meaner than a scalded cat, but he's got the wind for it." Otis was already moving toward the corral, calling over his shoulder, "Whatever fool notions got hold of you, Lowell, I hope to God it's the right one this time." At the depot, Clara sat on the bench beneath the eaves with her gloved hands folded in her lap, and let herself, just this once, remember him properly. She remembered a boy of 22 with dust on his hat and an earnestness that had embarrassed him. The way he'd stood in her father's dooryard turning his hat brim in his hands and asked, not for her father's blessing exactly, but for time. 1 year, enough to build a cabin and buy a start of cattle, enough to come back a man with something to offer instead of empty hands and a promise. She remembered the particular blue of that October sky, and the way he'd kissed her knuckles instead of her mouth because her father was watching from the porch, and the way he'd whispered, low enough for only her, that he'd write every week even if the letters took a month to find her. She remembered believing him entirely. She remembered her father's face, closed as a slammed door, the week the letters had simply stopped, though she had not known then, and had learned only after her father's own death 4 years later, going through his strongbox, that he had been intercepting every one of them, burning Jessie's words before she ever saw them, because a girl with land ought to marry a man with land, and Thomas Merritt's family had both. She had found in that same strongbox a bundle of her own letters to Jessie that had never been posted either, twine still knotted tight around them, her girlish hand on the direction lines, her whole heart written out and burned before it ever left the county. By the time she understood what her father had done, it no longer mattered. She was already a bride. Jessie was already gone again, having ridden in 11 months late, seen her married, and left without a word to her at all. She had heard of it only second-hand, from a woman at the mercantile, weeks after the fact. She had told herself for 8 years that a man who truly meant to keep a promise did not simply turn his horse around and vanish without so much as knocking on her door to ask why. She had never known he hadn't been given the chance to knock. Silas had seen to that too, she suspected now, though she'd never proven it. Silas had always had a talent for standing exactly where a thing needed blocking, and he had been calling on her father the very week Jessie rode back into the county. A fact she had never once put together until this morning, sitting on a cold bench, watching her whole life get loaded onto a baggage car. 10 minutes, the station master called, and Clara rose and smoothed her skirt, and did not look toward the road east, because there was no reason on this earth to look, and every reason not to. Mrs. Agatha Byon came hurrying up the platform with a basket over her arm, having walked the whole mile from her farm rather than let her friend leave without one last word. "I couldn't let you go without seeing you proper," Agatha said, breathless, pressing the basket into Clara's hands. Bread and a jar of her own plum preserves, and beneath the cloth, folded small, a single pressed flower Clara recognized bluebonnet from the back 40 from the spring. "You didn't have to," Clara said, throat tight. "Somebody in this town ought to send you off with kindness instead of Silas Merritt's gloating," Agatha said, loud enough that Silas, 20 feet off, went a shade redder. "It isn't right what's happening to you, Clara Merritt, and everybody with sense knows it. I only wish sense counted for more against a signed paper." "It's done," Clara said quietly. "There's no fighting it now. Mr. Whitlock looked at the note himself and said without a witness to the day it was signed, there's nothing to be done." "Mr. Whitlock said the ink troubled him," Agatha said. "He told my husband as much, not 2 nights past. Said Thomas's hand looked wrong on it, shakier than a well man writes, and steadier than a dying man manages. But troubled isn't proof, and proof is what the bank wants, and Silas has made certain nobody in this town has the courage or the coin to go looking harder." Clara had turned that thought over herself 100 times in the night these last 2 weeks, and arrived nowhere. Thomas had been a plain, decent man, not a passionate one, but she had known him 3 years as his wife, and never once heard him speak of owing his brother anything, quite the opposite. Thomas had disliked Silas with the quiet, permanent dislike of a man who'd spent a childhood being cheated at cards by an older brother, and never forgot it. It made no sense to her that he'd have signed the spring water rights over to Sela's of all people, debt or no debt. But sense wasn't proof either, and she was out of time to look for it. 5 minutes, the station master called. 2 miles east, Jesse put the second horse. A rangy, ill-tempered chestnut Otis had all but given him outright, into a hard gallop down the wagon road, and did not spare it, because there are mornings a man understands will not come again. He had spent 8 years telling himself he'd done the honorable thing, staying gone rather than making trouble for a married woman. He understood now, riding, that he had done the coward's thing instead, and called it honor to make it easier to swallow. A man who truly loved a woman did not ride away from her wedding without once asking her, to her face, whether she'd chosen it freely. He had assumed. He had let his pride assume, because the assuming hurt less than the asking might have. And pride was a cheap, cowardly comfort next to what it had cost them both. He would not make that mistake twice, in one lifetime. The chestnut cleared the low rise above the depot, with its sides heaving just as the whistle gave its first long call. The 5-minute warning, mournful and rising over the cottonwoods, and Jesse felt it in his chest like a hand closing. Below him, the platform was a small commotion of ordinary leaving. A farmer loading crates, a young mother with a basket of mending, and there, near the end, a woman in gray with her back straight as a fence rail. A woman he would have known from twice this distance in the dark, because some part of him had never once stopped memorizing the particular way Clara Vance held her shoulders when she was determined not to cry. He put his heels to the horse. Clara heard the hoofbeats before she understood what they meant, a hard, uneven drumming coming down the slope from the east road, too fast for anyone with sense, and she turned, along with half the platform, expecting some fool's runaway horse. It was Sela's who said the name first, disbelieving, half a laugh in it. "That's Lowell, that's Jesse Lowell." Clara's heart did something complicated and painful, a lurch that was hope and terror, and 8 years of buried grief all arriving at once. And she made herself look away, toward the train, because whatever this was, she could not afford to hope for it and be wrong. "All aboard," the conductor called. Jesse hauled the lathered chestnut up at the edge of the platform boards and swung down before it had fully stopped, and the whole depot turned to look at a dust-covered stranger with a wild horse and a wilder look about him. And none of that mattered to Jesse at all, because Clara Merritt was standing not 30 feet from him with a basket in her arms and her face gone pale, as the frost, still clinging to the shade side of the depot roof. Clara, just her name. He hadn't planned further than that. 8 years of unspoken things did not organize themselves easily into a single breath. "Mr. Lowell." Her voice was careful, formal, a wall going up brick by brick even as her eyes betrayed her, bright and stricken. "You've ridden hard for a stranger passing through." "I'm not passing through." He came closer, aware of the whole platform watching, aware of Silas's face curdling with something between fury and calculation, and did not care about either. "I heard you were leaving. I heard about Thomas, and I'm sorry for it, truly. He was a better man than his brother, from everything I ever heard, and I mean that as the plain compliment it is. But I heard about the land too, and about a paper nobody quite trusts, and I could not let that train pull out with you on it before somebody who still—" He stopped, made himself say the rest plainly, the way he should have said it 8 years before. "Before somebody who still loves you had the chance to ask you not to go." The platform had gone very quiet. 2 minutes, the conductor called, apologetic now, sensing the moment he'd stumbled into. "You didn't come," Clara said, and her voice shook for the first time. 8 years ago. You came home and you saw me married, and you turned around and rode off without a single word to me. Not a knock at my door, not one letter asking why. I built a whole life out of believing you simply decided I wasn't worth the asking. I decided that for both of us out of pure pride and a broken heart, and I have regretted it every day since, Jesse said. I didn't know your father was burning my letters until it was already too late to matter, Clara. I didn't know until this morning that you never got a single one of them. I thought you chose Merritt with your eyes wide open, and it gutted me, and I told myself the honorable thing was to let you be. I was wrong. Honor doesn't look like riding away from a woman without once asking her the truth. Silas stepped forward now, red-faced. This is a fine performance, Lowell, but the ladies' train is leaving, and the papers on that homestead are filed and signed. Whatever sob story you've ridden 2 horses half to death to tell her. Get on the train, Clara. There's nothing here worth staying for. 1 minute, the conductor called, and reached for the bell rope. Clara looked between the 2 men, the one who had broken her heart honestly, out of pain and pride, and the one who had spent 3 years quietly starving her of every kindness while smiling at church. And something in her, some old and buried spine she had not used in years, straightened. "Show it to me again," she said to Silas. "That paper, right here, right now in front of witnesses." "I've no obligation to carry a legal document to a train platform for your entertainment," Silas said. "You've carried it to the bank, to Judge Farrow, to half the men at the saloon who will listen to you crow about it." Agatha Byan cut in, stepping up beside Clara with the fierce protectiveness of a woman who'd watched a friend wronged too long to stay quiet now. "Surely, you can carry it 30 more feet, or is it only brave when it's got nobody standing near enough to look at it close?" A small crowd had gathered without Clara quite noticing, the farmer with his crates forgotten, the young mother, old Mr. Whitlock himself, drawn from his office across the street by the commotion, spectacles still in hand and his collar askew from hurrying. "Since Mr. Whitlock's here," Jesse said, and there was something of the old steadiness in his voice now, the voice of a man who'd spent 8 years learning to be certain before he spoke. "Let the man who studied the paper already say plainly, in front of this whole platform, whether he believes Thomas Merritt signed it of his own free will and sound hand." Whitlock hesitated, glancing at Silas, and then at Clara's face, and something in him, some old decency worn thin by years of small-town caution, but not yet gone, seemed to decide the matter. "I've said before that the signature troubled me," he said. "I'll say now plainly that I do not believe Thomas Merritt wrote his own name on that paper. The hand is wrong. Too firm for a man 3 weeks from his grave, and wrong in the loop of the M besides. Thomas always crossed his M's high, a habit from his schooling. This signature doesn't. I noted it a fortnight ago and said nothing louder than a private worry, because I hadn't the proof to back it, and I am ashamed of my own caution standing here now." The platform had gone dead silent, but for the idling engine. "That's an opinion," Silas said too quickly, "not proof." "It's proof enough to open an inquiry," Whitlock said, "and I intend to file for one this very afternoon with Judge Farrow, which I ought to have done a fortnight ago, instead of letting a widow be rushed off a platform before the ink had time to answer for itself." Silas's face had gone from red to a pale, ugly white. He looked, for one moment, like a man calculating how far he might still run with a lie before it caught him, and then he looked at the ring of faces around him, his neighbors, his banker's clerk hovering uneasily at the edge of the crowd, the schoolteacher who'd once taught his own children, the station master, and seemed to understand there was no more running room left in Half Moon for him. "Board," the conductor shouted, one hand already on the rail. The last words a man says before a train that will not wait for anyone's reckoning. And it was in that instant, Clara's mind still spinning with Whitlock's words, with Silas's unraveling, with 8 years cracking open all at once, that her foot, moving without her full attention as she stepped back to let the crowd shift around her, caught the edge of the platform step wrong, and the gap between the boards and the moving iron step of the car yawned suddenly wide and real beneath her, the train already beginning its first slow roll. She felt herself pitch forward, felt the cold shock of understanding that she was about to fall into that gap, and then a hand hard, sure, closing around her wrist like it had never once let go in 8 years, hauled her back and up and against a chest that smelled of trail dust and horse, and beneath it, faintly, of the same soap he'd always used, and the world steadied. "I've got you," Jesse said, low, right against her ear, his arm locked around her waist, both of them standing well back from the tracks now as the train pulled away empty of the one passenger it had been meant to carry. "I've got you, Clara. I mean to keep on having you if you'll let me." She was shaking from the near fall, from Silas, from 8 years. She could not have said which. And she let herself, for the first time since her father's strongbox had told her the truth of what had been stolen from her, simply lean into a man's chest and be held, right there on the platform, with half the town watching and none of it mattering at all. "You caught my hand," she said, half laughing, half in tears, before the whistle even finished. "I'd have caught it 8 years ago if I'd known there was a hand out there waiting," he said. "I don't intend to be late again." But trust, Clara found in the days that followed, was not restored simply because a hand had caught hers on a platform. 3 days after the depot, Jesse rode over at dusk to mend a sagging gatepost he'd noticed the morning of the rescue, and found her at the well, and the easy words of that first reunion had already gone stiff between them again. "You don't owe me anything for the gatepost," she said, when he wouldn't take payment for the lumber. "I'll not have the whole county saying Jesse Lowell is buying his way back into a widow's favor with fence rails." "I'm not buying anything," he said, setting down the maul with more force than the task required. "I'm trying to be useful to you in the only language I ever learned properly, Clara, because I don't rightly know how a man says sorry for 8 years in words that don't sound thin as creek water." "Maybe there isn't a way," she said, and heard the old hurt come out sharper than she'd meant it to. "Maybe I'm glad of what you did at the depot, truly glad, and still not ready to hand you the rest of my heart on the strength of one morning's ride. You left once without asking. I need to know you'd never do it again, and I don't know how a woman learns that from a man in under a week." He was quiet a long moment, turning his hat in his hands the same old way, and when he spoke again his voice had none of the depot's urgency in it, only a plain, worn honesty. "Then I'll come back tomorrow and mend the next thing that wants mending, and the day after that, for as long as it takes you to believe it isn't performance. I'm not asking you to trust me on the strength of one morning. I'm asking you to let me earn it the slow way, same as I ought to have done the first time, instead of riding off on my pride the moment it got difficult." It was not a grand answer, but it was the true one, and Clara found, watching him pick them all back up and finish the gatepost without another word of persuasion, that she believed it rather more than she had believed anything a man had told her in a very long while. The inquiry Whitlock filed took the better part of 3 weeks, and Clara lived through every day of it with her heart in her throat, staying on at the little house by the spring with Agatha camped in the spare room for company, and Jesse riding over most mornings on the mean chestnut, which had softened toward him considerably. Once it understood, he wasn't going anywhere either. Judge Farrow held the hearing in the schoolhouse itself, the county courthouse being 2 days' ride distant, and the matter, as he put it, too urgent to a widow's roof to wait for proper marble halls. Half of Half Moon crowded onto the children's benches to watch. Whitlock laid the forged note beside 3 genuine letters of Thomas Merritt's business correspondence, borrowed from the mercantile's own ledgers, and walked the judge through the crossed M's, the pressure of the pen, the ink itself. Too fresh by the color, he argued, for a signature meant to be 2 years old. The bank clerk, sweating under the weight of every eye in the room, admitted under Pharaoh's patient questioning that Silas had brought him the paper already signed, and had grown strangely insistent that it be processed quickly and quietly, before the widow had time to consult a lawyer of her own. Silas Merritt did not wait for the judge's written ruling. He sold what stock he could at a loss, and left the county before the spring thaw. His grazing ambitions ended along with his good name, and no one in Half Moon troubled themselves to wish him well on his way. Clara did not wait on any of it, in truth, to know her own mind. Within days of that morning at the depot she understood, with a clarity that startled her after 8 years of careful numbness, that whatever the judge decided about the land, she had already decided about the man. Jesse sold his last string of horses to the army post rather than drive them on to the next contract, and put the money instead into a new roof and a mended fence line, working the land at her side rather than for her, the way he ought to have offered 8 years before, asking nothing of her but the chance to keep on asking. They were married in June, in the same dooryard, where a 22-year-old cowboy had once turned his hat brim in his hands and asked a girl for 1 year. The bluebonnets were up thick along the spring that day, and Agatha Byan had cut armfuls of them for the schoolhouse window-sills and for Clara's own hair, weeping openly and without shame through the whole short ceremony. Old Otis Prout gave away the bride, since Clara's own father was long past forgiving, and said afterward it was the finest thing he'd done with a Tuesday in 20 years. Whitlock stood near the back in his good coat, looking, for once, entirely unashamed of his own caution, since it had finally amounted to something worth standing up for. And when the minister asked if any man had cause why they should not be joined, the only sound was the wind moving through the cottonwoods down by the spring, patient, the way it had always been, waiting for the two of them to finally catch up to it. Clara thought, standing there in her mother's altered wedding dress with Jesse's rough hand warm around her own, that there was a particular grace in a love that had been lost, mourned, and found again, that it did not erase the years between, but it made a person understand, in her very bones, exactly what she held, and exactly what it had cost to hold it. She had spent 8 years believing herself unchosen. She had learned, on a depot platform with a train pulling away empty, that she had been chosen all along, and only the truth of it had been stolen from her by smaller, meaner hands than either hers or Jesse's. She never did take that post in Laramie. She wrote to her old friend there instead to say that a schoolhouse nearer home might yet have need of a teacher come autumn for Half Moon's own children, and before too many more years had passed, for a boy of her own with his father's steady hands and his mother's stubborn, hopeful heart, born the following spring in the same little house, by the spring that had so nearly been taken from them both, and never was, and never would be again, while Jessie Lowell had breath left to stand in the doorway of it.